Hello to everyone, and welcome to another Friends of Multilateralism Group FMG interview series on MC12 and Beyond. And my name is Xiankun Lu. I'm the CEO of FMG, and FMG is a think tank we established in 2016, focusing on WTO reform. And today we have the privilege to have our fellow member Victor do Prado. He is also the former director of WTO division in charge of Trade Negotiation Committee, General Council, and Ministerial Conference. So today we're going to focus on one key aspect of Ministerial Conference, MC12, is about the process. So Victor, thanks a lot for being with us.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Okay, thanks. Victor, about the process, I mean, you and I, we have been sitting in ministerial conferences for too many times. So we know what used to be a kind of practice. And then from my personal impression, I see something a little bit different. And if we could divide a ministerial conference process into two aspects, so the formal process and the informal process, which features always around ministerial conference in the past. So first on the formal process, we did see the opening and closing session, and there's not much about that. Very excellent statements by DG and others. But I also see something different, which is that the previous practice of organizing this so-called plenary session, where ministers will go to the podium, make their statements, while other minister or delegates will sit there and listen. It's not there anymore. And instead, they have asked the ministers to send their statements and the videos, recordings in advance of the meeting, and then put them on the website immediately after the opening session. So which, I mean, not my word, but in the word of Reuters, to stop wasting time. Of course, I know that the minister's statements are very important. All of them are really touching upon the key issues. But this different way of organizing, what do you think about that? And what's your impression based on your experience organizing ministerial conferences?
Thank you. It's a very good question. And I guess we have to tackle the reply into what is the use of the plenary session, and to what extent was it really different from past ministerials. Surely it's a different format that was used for this specific part of the ministerial conferences, which is the 3-minute speeches by all ministers that wish to speak. But that has not, I think, really given any rise to criticism by ministers, because in my view this was well done. Remember, I left the WTO about 3 months ago, so I was in charge still of giving suggestions on the organization of the ministerial when MC12 was supposed to take place in November, December. This whole reflection about having videos instead of a in-person delivery of the 3-minute speeches began, it's quite funny, because of space constraints. Because once we knew that we would not have the convention center in Geneva, the CICG as we call it, available for the ministerial, and that the decision was taken to have the ministerial in the Centre William Rapart, so the headquarters of the WTO, there was less space. And blocking a room for the plenary session, the 3-minute speeches, became an issue because there were just so many available rooms. And so this idea came up that we would instead ask ministers to record their videos. Now, you're right. We usually think about ministerial conferences between formal and informal processes, and somehow they have their own importance. The formal process, as you mentioned, starts with the opening session. The opening session is a very ceremonial type of session. Speeches by the ministerial conference chair, by the DG. But there's something very important that many people do not pay attention that happens at the opening ceremony, which is a report by the council, General Council chair. The chairperson of the General Council makes a report and transfers all of the documents and a report of the state of play from the General Council to the ministers. So I would say, even if you didn't have many speeches, this is procedurally, this is the most important thing that happens in the opening ceremony. We are now no longer in General Council mode. We are now in ministerial mode, and ministers, here are the documents. Here's the situation that is in front of you now. This is very important in an opening ceremony. Of course, people don't pay much attention to this. They would be paying attention more to the political ceremonial part. But in terms of procedure, this is what is important. And in past ministerials, you had at least the first plenary. And the tradition is that the hosts of the past ministerial conferences would take priority in speaking at the first plenary. And for that first plenary, you would usually have a lot of people, because in that first plenary, you have members like Singapore, MC1, Switzerland, MC2, the United States, MC3, etc., etc. So these are important members, and people would stay there to listen to these members. So I don't think there was much loss in doing the videos. I actually was looking at some of the videos. They're very nicely done. There's a difference in style, and you can watch it again. You can interrupt it and watch it later. So I think it was a good move.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Victor. The one element you have mentioned is actually very important, and then I agree that people tend to a little bit don't pay attention to, is that the switch from the General Council mode to the ministerial conference. I think that explains more than just procedural, by saying that we are moving from the second layer of decision making, the General Council by ambassadors, to the highest decision making body, the ministerial conference by ministers, of course. But also more importantly, and related to substance, as you said, the ambassadors and the officials have been working so hard to prepare documents, drafts, and potential outcomes. So that's where people are, the General Council chair, if I understand correctly, is providing a whole landscape of a potential MC12 outcome, that these are what we have done. So now it's up to you to fill in the gaps, taking away the brackets, and so on and so forth. So I think that's a key feature of the process, right?
It is a key feature of the process. And remember, ministerial conferences are prepared during months, years. In this case, Ambassador Chambovet of Switzerland had been preparing, and before him, Ambassador Castillo of Honduras had been preparing, with the assistance of the Secretariat, the outcome document, which is a very important document, basically the ministerial declaration, if you will. There was the whole issue of the WTO response to the pandemic, which was also directly being coordinated by the General Council and a facilitator. So these things are the result of long processes that then get transferred to the ministers. Now, something I didn't say, Lou, and I think it's important to say that, is that ministers still had a lot of opportunity to speak in front of each other during those other sessions, the informal ones. So the one you mentioned, the first HOD's sort of informal session on the challenges to the multilateral trading system, which was something that did not necessarily happen in the past, but because of the current geopolitical situation, the war in Ukraine, economic situation, the dire economic situation out there, the consequences of the conflict, it was felt that it was important that ministers have an opportunity to say something about these challenges in an informal setting. And that perhaps is even more important than the 3-minute speech that were recorded. Although, again, if you look at some of these speeches, you will see important messages being given there that I would imagine coincide with some of the things that were said during this very first informal session. And then you get into the sort of mechanics of how do you do the HODs, the thematic HODs, and we had quite a few of those because the menu for MC12 was quite large. You had many issues on the table, with a plan for a horizontal HODs, as we call it, where you tackle all of the issues, which is an important transparency exercise at the end of every day, so that you have the thematic discussions during the day, and then in the evening, you do a horizontal transparency session where you basically do a report of what happened during the day, and then you continue with the informal consultations in various formats. So variable geometry, as we say, during the evening and during the day as well.
That's the informal part. We will come back later. But coming back on the formal aspect, I also noticed, as you say, that the minister were given quite some opportunities to do this session on challenges of multilateral trading system, but also during the few days, thematic sessions on key issues of the around WTO, the pandemic, WTO reform, so on and so forth. So that's where I also see a lot of interaction, and also if you look at, we look at carefully speeches, and as you said, quite some interesting messages, especially by the key players. So that's something you also said this, but I just want to confirm, it's not this way of informal session on the challenges as well as the thematic sessions is not often organized in previous, if not at all, right?
The challenges one, you're right, it's not always organized like this. And not always you have the thematic sessions. You probably had in the past some thematic sessions, but not organized in this manner. The first time we did these thematic sessions, organized in this sort of calendar way, and we actually we circulated the calendar to give ministers agenda some predictability, was in Buenos Aires. We didn't do that in, say, Nairobi or in Bali, but at Buenos Aires, the then chair of the conference, Minister Susana Macorra, said, I would like to have an agenda for the meeting, not the formal agenda. We'll come back to the formal agenda in a minute, but basically a schedule of meetings. Which issues are we going to discuss in an informal setting, in which rooms, so that ministers can plan their calendar during their schedules during the ministerial, so that they can have their bilaterals, their group coordination, and etc. So we already had that at Buenos Aires, and this time around, it's just that the menu was broader and more numerous. So the thematic sessions became a centerpiece of the calendar.
Yeah, thank you, Victor. So other than the formal process, I mean, the informal process always plays a key role in the WTO negotiations, especially those during the ministerial conferences. And one aspect of this which got my attention immediately was this revival of green room process. We know the history about green rooms, so on and so forth, But we also know that for certain years, because of different views, criticism on it, the green room was put aside, and it was a different way of organizing, more transparent, inclusive. But we know that, I mean, as policy experts, we know that efficiency and democracy or transparency doesn't go hand in hand. So if we allow, I always tell my students that if you allow each minister to speak for 5 minutes and then 164, you will easily come to days and nights. So that's why, at least personally, and many of our fellow members also support to have this informal process. So that's why I saw that I read from newspapers saying that green rooms were a lot used at MC12, and of course with various configurations, some 20 members on one issue and some 8 members on another thing, and so on and so forth. So our fellow member Peter Anfenkong has put in his blog say that what was different this time is that there were more and a greater variety of smaller meetings, and there was more movement and fluidity. So what do you think about this revival of the green process and how it plays such a role in pushing forward the negotiations?
I think it's a good thing, and I think it's important that the chair of the conference and the DG use all types of techniques, all types of consultations to reach a positive result. I mean, what we're talking here is a process that leads to consensus. So I don't think people should subtract from their toolbox tools that might be useful to reach consensus. And one of those tools is the green room. Now, I don't want to say this too loud, but the green room has never really disappeared. It's just that it was not called the green room. And the green room is a very fluid concept, right? There was a time when you had a fixed sort of number of people and a fixed membership who would be called into the Director General consultation meeting in the headquarters, the so-called green room. But then in ministerial conferences, we tried to have a larger room for ministers. And in the past, the ministers were basically the same ministers of the ambassadors who were meeting in the green room. This is long past. Things have become much more fluid, much more interesting, because the composition of the so-called green room, and we'll have to talk more about what is the real green room and what was the green room in MC12. The composition depends on what issue you are discussing. So it may vary because the members who have more interest in an issue may not be the same as the ones who have a keen interest on another issue. And again, you have to keep that flexibility to reach consensus. So as I understand it, during MC12, you had at least 3 types of green room. There was a larger one in room D, which had some 40 members, and nobody was being stopped from coming into that room. And a lot of the discussions took place in room D. Then you had 20-something members in what was called the green room, but was taking place in the library of the Centre William Rappard. And then you still have what we internally call the green room, which is that table with some 30 chairs around it in the DG office, where the chair of the conference and the DG were consulting with members, ministers, as necessary in different numbers. So it's a sort of a concentric circle. And then, of course, you have the heads of delegation where everybody is present. That's not the green room. The green room is something restricted. I think what was interesting this time was that you had this multi-layer. You had the room D, the library, and the real green room. But I also think it's positive that it was kept fluid, that people were invited as per their interest to consult with the chair and the DG. And the result being that you had a positive result, although it was thin. It was until the very last moment, they didn't know whether they were going to get a positive result. So that's where things I think we need to improve. We'll talk about that in a minute. But again, in different ministerial conferences, you also had a variety of processes that were occurring, maybe not with a green room name, but consultations were taking place.
Yeah, thank you, Victor. That's excellent, and especially about a kind of fluidity concept of blue room, different composition. And one aspect, of course, with the evolving evolution of the membership composition, the green room already changes from previous MCs. The first thing is that the UK is now independent member. And also we have a Nigeria coming as a kind of heavyweight African one. So what I heard is that both of them were included in MC12, but not in previous ones. So that's first thing. The second thing, more kind of as an anecdote, what I heard is that the green room in the library went on for maybe 1 or 2, and then because of the weather, it was too hot, so that they have to move to room Eve, if I'm not mistaken, where that you have more air comes in, so that helps to chill not only the air down, but also their heads down. Probably that's how they can make things happen.
But you see, Lou, just to come back to the, whether the UK was there or not, or Nigeria was there or not. Again, there's no novelty to this. The composition of the green room has evolved a lot from the early days where it was really restricted to the later days where Pascal Lamy, for example, decided to invite a representative of the LDCs, so the coordinator of the ACPs, the coordinator of the African group. And you see there's a lot of overlap between ACPs, African group, LDCs. Some members belong to the 3 groups, and the 3 coordinators were being called. And then depending on the issue, if we're talking about agriculture, for example, you would have the G33, again, overlapping composition, plus the Cairns group, another layer. So it extended a lot. This time I hear the ACPs were being consulted very intensively because of the fisheries negotiations, and the ACPs are very numerous. Also, you should not forget the UK is there now, but you always had the European Commission plus the EU member that is currently in the presidency of the EU. So it might be that you have another EU member there together with the representative of the Commission. So again, it's not cast in stone that you have a composition and it's always the same. It varies a lot.
Yeah, that's actually probably the beauty of this informal process, to keep it fluid and also kind of depending.
Although some people are always there, right, Lou?
There's
some big guys who are always there.
Yeah, some big guys, and also what we call some middle grounders are always here. That's what we always see. But another thing is, of course, we know that informal process is informal, and even it is more or less representative. Some members are not there, and some members maybe are never there. I mean, for the green rooms. So one aspect very important, what we have always seen is that, and also what I heard is also the case for this ministerial conference, is try to connect the informal process to the formal process, so as to legitimize it. So which comes to the informal house, the head of delegations, where ministers or head of delegations come together from all membership, if they want, come together and to discuss what has happened in the green room or other informal process. and then provide their inputs, so as you have a kind of ownership building among the whole membership instead of only some 20 also members. So what do you think about that process?
Well, it's a very delicate process. It's a very difficult one. Just think about the tensions that happen during these days. It's a very limited and concentrated amount of issues to be dealt with in a limited amount of time. And then you have to make sure that everybody feels that they have ownership on this issue. So this process of going from the very small group to the larger one has to be managed with a lot of care, lest the ministers who are left out become irritated with the process. We saw that in past ministerials very often. I remember in Nairobi where you had the discussions amongst 5 members on the elimination of agricultural export subsidies, and the conference was also extended by a day. You had those 5 members discussing, and everybody else was waiting, and ministers got quite irritated with that prolonged waiting. There's only so many official bilateral meetings that a minister can have. How do you fill up the agenda of a minister? And so managing this process is very delicate, is very difficult, especially at a moment when people are very stressed. But it is important that the transparency happens and that you feel that everybody has some ownership of the final product.
Yeah, thanks, Victor. So you also mentioned some smaller informals, a smaller configuration. What I read and also heard is that let's take the example of the trade response to the pandemic. First, we saw this so-called Quad, the new Quad, not the traditional one. So it's basically the US, EU, India, and South Africa, which tabled a proposal on the TRIPS waiver, and which immediately caught a lot of attention. But on top of that, what I heard also at the last minute, almost like something 20 minutes before the transparency informal house meeting at 3 o'clock in the morning, China-US was intensely negotiating between themselves. So the two of them were discussing about this famous footnote 1 of the TRIPS waiver document, about eligible outcomes, so which developed countries should be eligible and whether China would opt out of benefiting from this flexibility. So that's one key point there. Probably you could also talk about, as compared to previous ones, how the major players play this role, but also kind of a smaller group that comes in.
Yeah, it's not unusual that you have these last-minute bilateral talks to iron out the agreement. It's this time it was interesting, of course, and I heard the same thing that you did, and I read the footnote that is very imaginative. It's a very creative way of preserving China's claim of being a developing country, but then China unilaterally opting out of it. So it saves everybody's position, and yet you create something that works. And that I find fascinating and important. And I think it's fantastic that the EU, the US and China got together, talked about it, found a creative solution, which serves the whole membership. And again, we saw some examples, maybe not as dramatic in the past. In Bali, the US and India had to come up with a solution on PSH, basically to save the trade facilitation agreement that was being agreed. There was an issue with the text of the Bali ministerial declaration between the US and Cuba. So very late in the day, the DG and the chair of the conference had to mediate a conversation between the US and Cuba, and you see how difficult that is. I mean, these countries have no diplomatic relations as such. And these things, the important thing is that you have people who are committed to finding a solution. These solutions are never easy. If they were, we would not need to spend all the time in a ministerial, we would not need to extend the ministerial. But these are moments of, say, political drama, if you will, that sparkle something that may produce an agreement. And we are so happy that in the end it works. But very often it does take personal commitment. And I would say that the persons matter a lot. The personality of the negotiator on one side, the personality of the negotiator on the other side, and the willingness to craft something that will be accepted by all and to find a solution that works for them. And here, I think the representatives of the US and China were very smart in finding a compromise that worked for them and worked for everybody.
Yeah, that brings back my memories about something that when I was a delegate, we have done 2004 framework. Remember, at that moment, we still have a concept called RAMs, recently acceded members. And there was a word about the so-called particular interests of RAMs. And I remember I was assisting my vice minister then to negotiate bilateral with the US to persuade them to put the word particular into that framework agreement. So that's the first thing. So as you said, sometimes it happens, but some others it didn't happen. We both saw, have witnessed in 2008, and everything was more or less done. And then at the last minute, I think it's both a kind of lack of political will, but also personal commitment, if I could say so, for 2008. It collapsed as such, and it was such a dramatic thing after it. We saw what happened in the WTO. The hall there where ministers make very tough statements on the failure. So anyway, but the other thing I want to also bring maybe to our attention is not only the big players, their bilaterals, but even smaller ones. They also have their key interests, which needs to be protected, and that's also work out from the informals, which I saw is let's say fisheries now. So you also mentioned the ACP play a very key role there, and the fisheries has a paragraph 12, which they call it nicknamed as a sunset clause, which basically say that many things are left out. So overfishing, overcapacity subsidies, development, special and differential treatment, so on and so forth. So the disciplines were not enough. So ACP came out last minute and said that no, we cannot allow agreement unless we continue to negotiate and then finalize this, let's say, in next 2 years. So that comes also at the last minute. And the good thing is that what I heard, that ACP negotiated with other key players, including US, China, EU, and so on and so forth. And then they made it happen. So that's also a very interesting thing to see, that how smaller members could also be brave to express themselves, defend their interests, and then using the informal process at the last minute and to make it happen. So what do you think about that?
I think it's remarkable. And again, the ACPs have done a fantastic job here. But I want to insist on a point, and I don't want to at all say that smaller members have a smaller role because of their size. I think it's very important that you also pay attention to the people who are there. And in the case of fisheries, you had a person like Wayne McCook, who knows the issue super well, and who was involved in these negotiations again with another hat. And you know, as you say, for them this is of top priority. They need this, and they know how to use sort of their influence and the system. And this is the beauty of the WTO. Very often, just because you are a small economy, you are not left out. This is the beauty of the consensus. You have the possibility of making your point and getting a result that suits, that fits your priority. Now, you have to know how to use the system, right? You have to know the nuts and bolts of the negotiation. You have to know when to intervene, how to intervene, what to put. It's not for beginners, let's put it this way. This is a game for professionals. And you do have professionals and people who know the system also in the smaller economies. And God knows we know how intelligent and how capable some of these negotiators from the smaller countries are. So it's interesting, it's fascinating to see it happening.
Yeah, it's true. I also heard that Wayne played a nice role behind this. And I'm going to interview him this afternoon, so we will listen to him about fisheries and what has happened with more details. So we have talked so much about MC12, the process, both formal and informal. So maybe one last thing we can do is that based on your experiences and what do you think as a last message, I mean, to the audience and also possibly to the secretariat, your former colleagues, as well as to the minister ambassadors, that what are the kind of things done better or continue to be done well, and what are things that should come in future kind of ministerial conference, and so as we would see the same thing, quite a positive atmosphere where members sit together, negotiate, and agree on something, and if that process could be continued through a better process, I think we will see a totally different WTO in the future, right?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, the first thing is to congratulate everyone who was involved in this process, because it was magic. And I've been in ministerial conferences where you have a final positive result, and it's fantastic. You've witnessed that as well. So congratulations to everyone. And I think it's never too late, and something that needs to be done by the Secretariat and by members, which is something the European call a post-mortem. Get together and think what went right, what went wrong, and how we can improve. What frightens me always is how delicate and how sensitive these processes are. And how one moment it can go wrong or go right. And I'm not sure we manage this, that we know how to manage this going right or going wrong very well. There are issues that always, from a secretariat point of view, for example, have troubled me, which is issuing the final documents too close to the closing ceremony. You have to give people a little bit of time to look at the final draft with the final wording. And yet, very often you don't have time to send them to capitals because of different time zones and etc. And you don't want to give people too much time as well, so that they come back with different instructions and the whole thing unravels. It's a delicate technique there. It's an art. It's not a science. But I think we need to reflect about this art of achieving positive results through consultations in the future, and think about the different consultative processes. But again, there's no recipe that works for all times. The geopolitical conditions change, people change, the issues change. What I do know is that the personal relationships between the ministers also matter a lot. So if there's one advice that I would give is make sure you have ministers meeting each other more frequently. Make sure that there are mini ministerials perhaps more frequently. This can be very helpful. Also, senior officials meetings, we haven't had those, and it's nobody's fault. This was a COVID time. It was all very difficult. But if God permits, we really get out of COVID, I think we should be having those senior officials meetings more regularly, mini ministerials more regularly, and get the ministers to know each other and build trust amongst each other in a way that helps when you have a big ministerial conference again.
Yeah, and that's an excellent point. I mean, to add to our discussion, really, I mean, from my personal also experience in the past, that the senior official meeting, SOMS meeting, and mini ministerial meetings plays quite a significant role in getting things done. Remember, before Hong Kong, China in Dalian organized a mini ministerial, and also the other ministerial, I forgot which one, but Australia and China co-organized the senior official meeting from the capitals, and where things were moved ahead. So these things actually need to be done more regularly and more frequently. And also, we are seeing a new proposal by Brazil saying that even the ministerial conference should be organized not biannual but annual, so as to give them the time to know each other, as you said, to build up trust, personal chemistry, personal relationship. That also, as we discussed, that the kind of personal relationship sometimes plays a lot in the thing. The other thing also, what you said is about how delicate and how much you need to be attentive to manage the process by when to issue the final draft and how much time to give them, not too much, but not too short. And this is actually brings to the attention the heroes behind the scene, as you were when you were the director. That much of the time we see the ministers sitting in a shed light and in front of cameras, but actually behind them we have the secretariat team and your former colleagues actually behind this to help drafting the documents and then providing a process technical support, even the coffee, I mean, which they need a lot for when they burn the night oil. So those are things we need to reflect upon. Those are also key elements in both the formal and informal process which make the MC12 successful. So with that, Victor, thanks a lot for being with us and sharing so much information and so many good stories and your experience. I think those will be very important for our audience. A lot of things we could go deeper in the future and talk more. Thank you very much. And
thank you very much for having me, Lou. I really enjoyed this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.